Blood soaks into the fertile soil, mixing with the ashes of a burning barn. The sickening thud of a shovel against bone is the last sound echoing in the freezing autumn air. Greed makes monsters out of ordinary neighbors. They take everything: the harvest, the money, the future, leaving behind only a broken corpse in the mud. But the universe has a strange way of balancing the scales. When death is not the end, but a reset button, vengeance takes root. Sometimes, the sweetest revenge isn't fought with fists or fire, but planted quietly in the dirt, waiting to be stolen. The sharp metallic taste of blood was the last thing I swallowed before the darkness took me. It wasn't a peaceful slipping away. It was violent, terrifying, and saturated with the smell of wood smoke and wet earth. I could still feel the excruciating crunch of my own ribs giving way under the heavy steel of Bradley Higgins' gardening spade. I could still hear his father, Walter, laughing a low, wheezing chuckle as he loaded burlap sacks of my life's work into the back of his rusted Ford pickup. Martha, Walter's wife, stood near the edge of my field holding a kerosene lantern, her face twisted in a sneer of pure, unjustified contempt, providing the light for my murder. They had taken everything. My prized crop of crested white yams, a rare, highly sought-after tuber I had spent 5 agonizing years crossbreeding and cultivating in the unique loamy soil of my farm. Chefs in the city were paying upwards of $800 a pound for them. That harvest was supposed to be the salvation for my younger sister, Lily. It was supposed to pay for the experimental pulmonary surgery she so desperately needed. Instead, the Higgins family, who owned the sprawling, mismanaged cattle ranch next door, decided that my hard work was their windfall. When I caught them digging up my field in the dead of night, they didn't run. They turned on me. Bradley swung the shovel. Walter lit the barn on fire to cover the evidence. As I lay bleeding out in the mud, choking on my own blood and the smoke of my burning livelihood, my last thought was of Lily, dying alone in her bedroom, waiting for a brother who would never come back. Then I opened my eyes. I didn't wake up in the mud. I didn't wake up in a hospital. I woke up thrashing, screaming silently, my hands clutching at a chest that was completely whole. My mattress was soaked in cold sweat. The familiar, rhythmic ticking of the old grandfather clock in the hallway echoed through the quiet house. The air smelled of pine needles and old wood, not smoke and copper. I threw off the quilt, my breath coming in ragged, desperate gasps. I stumbled out of bed, my legs trembling so violently, I practically crawled to the mirror hanging over the oak dresser. The face staring back at me was mine, but it wasn't bruised. There were no lacerations across my forehead. My eyes were wide and frantic, but my skin was unblemished. I scrambled to the window and pushed aside the curtains. My barn, the one I had watched burn to the ground in a roaring inferno, stood perfectly intact under the pale moonlight, its red paint looking deep and black in the shadows. The tractor was parked neatly beside it. I spun around and looked at the calendar tacked to the wall beside my bedroom door. September 12th. I dropped to my knees, the realization hitting me like a physical blow. The night I was murdered was October 10th. I knew this because it was the night of the Oak Haven Autumn Festival, the night the whole town was gathered at the high school football field, drinking cider and watching fireworks. The Higgins family had used the noise and the empty roads as their cover. I had been sent back, almost a full month before the theft, a full month before my death. Tears, hot and fast, spilled down my cheeks. I scrambled up and ran down the hall, throwing open the door to Lily's room. She was asleep, curled up under her heavy blankets, her chest rising and falling with the slight, rhythmic wheeze that had haunted my days. The monitor beside her bed blinked a steady, reassuring green. She was alive. She was here. I leaned against the doorframe, pressing my fist to my mouth to stifle a sob of pure, unadulterated relief. The universe, in all its infinite, incomprehensible mystery, had given me a second chance. But as the panic and relief began to subside, a new, dark emotion took root in my chest. It was a cold, calculating rage. The memory of Bradley's smirk as he swung the spade down on my head wasn't a nightmare. It was a promise of what was to come. The Higgins family were parasites. They had spent decades bullying the county, moving property lines, stealing livestock, and intimidating anyone who stood up to them. Walter Higgins was a petty tyrant who believed the world owed him everything he could grab. They thought I was just a weak, dirt-farming orphan trying to take care of a sick sister. They thought I was an easy mark. I walked slowly back to my room, the floorboards creaking under my bare feet. I looked out the window again, staring across the property line toward the dark silhouette of the Higgins ranch house on the hill. I could take the harvest early. I could sell it now, at a slightly lower yield, pack up Lily, and leave Oakhaven forever. We could disappear to the city, get her the surgery, and start over. That was the logical choice. That was the safe choice. But as I stared at the field where I had died, I knew I couldn't do that. Fleeing wouldn't change what they were. They would just find another victim. They had killed me once. Extinguished my life over a patch of vegetables with zero hesitation or remorse. No, I thought. The cold rage solidifying into a diamond-hard resolve. I am not going to run. They wanted my harvest. They were willing to kill for it. I smiled, a slow, grim stretching of my lips that didn't reach my eyes. If the Higgins family wanted my crop so badly, I was going to let them have it. I was going to let them dig it up with their own hands. But this time, I wouldn't try to stop them. I would sit back and watch. Because what they were going to steal wouldn't make them rich. It would send them straight to hell. The next 3 nights were the most grueling of my life, both past and present. The crested white yam is a notoriously finicky crop. It requires a highly specific soil pH, a precise balance of nitrogen and potassium, and an incredible amount of manual care to ensure the tubers grow large and symmetrical without splitting. I had dedicated half an acre to them, surrounded by a high deer fence. To the untrained eye, the leafy green tops looked like ordinary weeds. But beneath the soil, a fortune was waiting. I had to get the real yams out. Every night, precisely at midnight, I slipped out the back door of the farmhouse. I didn't dare use the tractor or even the floodlights on the barn. The Higgins ranch was situated on a slight elevation that gave them a clear line of sight to my fields. Walter was an insomniac who often sat on his back porch smoking cheap cigars, watching the valley. If he saw activity in my prize field at night, he would get suspicious. Instead, I used a miner's headlamp covered with a piece of red cellophane. The dim, crimson light was enough to guide my hands but wouldn't carry across the distance. I worked on my hands and knees, using a small hand trowel to carefully loosen the soil around the precious tubers. Pulling a massive 2-pound crested white yam from the earth is usually a moment of triumph. In the red dark, it was an act of desperate preservation. I brushed the loose dirt from the pale, knobby skin, the scent of the earthy, truffle-like aroma filling my nostrils. I wrapped each tuber individually in newspaper and placed them gently into padded wooden crates. By 4:00 a.m. each night, my muscles screamed. My fingernails were torn and packed with dirt, and my back felt like it was on fire. I loaded the crates onto a heavy-duty wheelbarrow and pushed them half a mile deep into the woods behind my property, to an old, natural limestone root cellar left over from the original homesteaders in the 1800s. The temperature in the cave was a constant 50 degrees, perfect for curing and storing the yams until I could safely transport them to the city. By the end of the 3rd night, my field was empty of its treasure, but the soil was severely disturbed. Anyone looking closely would see the dark, overturned earth. I needed to refill the holes, and I needed to do it with something that looked exactly like what I had taken out. It was time to go foraging. 50 miles north of Oakhaven lay the Blackwood Marshes, a sprawling, treacherous expanse of wetlands completely untouched by development. It was a place of stagnant water, thick mosquitoes and dense rotting vegetation. It was also home to one of the most violently toxic plants native to the continent, Oenanthe crocata, commonly known as hemlock water dropwort. Locals had a more fitting name for it: dead man's fingers. The plant is notoriously deceptive. The green tops look incredibly similar to parsley or celery, but it's the roots that are the real danger. They grow in pale, yellowish-white clusters, looking terrifyingly identical to wild parsnips or, in my case, young, crested white yams. They even have a pleasant, slightly sweet smell, But within those pale roots courses, onanthotoxin, a highly potent neurotoxin. Ingesting even a small amount attacks the central nervous system within minutes. It causes uncontrollable, violent seizures, nausea, the shutting down of organs, and, very quickly, death. It is so notoriously toxic that livestock who merely chew on a root exposed by a muddy bank often drop dead before the farmer even notices they are sick. One of the most chilling side effects of the toxin is the contraction of the facial muscles, leaving the victim with a grotesque, forced smile, the risus sardonicus, at the moment of death. I drove my truck to the edge of the marsh just as the sun was rising on the fourth day. I wore thick, elbow-length heavy rubber gloves, a face mask, and protective goggles. Even handling the plant roughly can release the toxic sap onto the skin, and I wasn't taking any chances. Wading into the muck, I spent 6 hours hunting for the specific clusters of dropwort. Whenever I found a patch, I carefully dug down, extracting the massive, tuberous root systems. They were perfect. Thick, pale, and practically indistinguishable from the yams I had hidden in the limestone cave. The sweet, deceptive scent of them wafted up through the damp morning air, masking their lethal nature. I harvested nearly 200 pounds of the toxic roots, sealing them tightly in heavy-duty plastic bins in the bed of my truck. That night, the real work began. Under the cover of my red headlamp, I went back into my empty field. I took the dropwort roots, the dead man's fingers, and planted them exactly where my yams had been. I was meticulous. I didn't just throw them in the dirt. I positioned them carefully, packing the loamy soil around them so they felt firmly rooted. I replanted the harmless green tops of my harvested yams over the toxic roots, ensuring the foliage looked completely natural. I spent hours smoothing the soil, using a wide broom to sweep away my footprints and the distinct marks of the trowel. I sprayed the field lightly with a hose to settle the dust and make the ground look uniformly weathered. When the sun finally crested over the hills the next morning, illuminating the valley in a wash of gold, I stood on my back porch sipping a cup of black coffee. I looked out over the field. It looked lush, undisturbed, and incredibly valuable. No one would ever know that a field of fortune had been transformed into a minefield of agonizing death. The trap was set. Now, all I had to do was make sure the rats smelled the cheese. The key to a successful trap is ensuring the prey thinks finding the bait was their own brilliant idea. I couldn't just wait for the Higgins family to decide to rob me. In my past life, they had found out about the value of my crop because I had foolishly shown a sample to a local appraiser, and word had gotten back to Walter. This time, I needed to control the flow of information. I needed to ensure they knew exactly how much the field was worth, and exactly when it would be prime for the taking. On a crisp Tuesday morning, 2 weeks before the Autumn Festival, I drove my dusty truck into downtown Oak Haven. I parked in front of Brenda's Diner, the local gossip hub. The diner was a classic small-town establishment: checkered floors, vinyl booths, and an atmosphere thick with the smell of bacon grease and stale coffee. I walked in, letting the bell above the door chime loudly. I scanned the room. Perfect. Sitting in the back corner booth, hunched over a plate of eggs and a newspaper, was Walter Higgins. His massive, broad-shouldered son, Bradley, was sitting across from him, aggressively chewing a piece of toast. I ignored them completely and walked up to the counter, taking a stool next to Simon Fletcher. Simon was a regional produce broker, a man who connected local farmers with high-end restaurants in the city. He was also known to have a mouth larger than a bullfrog's. "Morning, Simon," I said loudly, slapping a $20 bill on the counter. "Brenda, coffee for me, and whatever Simon's having is on my tab." Simon looked up, his eyebrows raised in surprise. "Well, Jonathan, you're in a mighty fine mood for a Tuesday. Did you strike oil out on that little patch of dirt of yours?" I laughed, a rich, booming sound that I knew carried perfectly to the back booth. "Better than oil, Simon. Better than oil. You remember those experimental tubers I told you about a few years back? The crested whites?" Simon nodded, taking a sip of his diner coffee. "Sure. The truffles of the yam world. Impossible to grow in this climate, I told you. Well, you were wrong, I said, leaning in. But keeping my voice deliberately projected. They took. Not only did they take, but the yield is monstrous. I pulled a test root yesterday. It weighed almost 2.5 pounds. Pure white, perfect marbling. Simon practically choked on his drink. 2.5 pounds? Jonathan, if the quality is restaurant grade, you're looking at close to $1,000 a pound from the Michelin kitchens. I slapped the counter happily. I know! I ran the math. I've got half an acre out there, Simon. I'm looking at a payout that's going to clear my mortgage and pay for Lily's surgery twice over. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw the newspaper in Walter Higgins' hands lower by an inch. The diner had gone strangely quiet. The clatter of silverware dulling as people eavesdropped on the astronomical numbers being thrown around. When are you pulling them? Simon asked, his eyes gleaming with the prospect of a commission. I can get a refrigerated truck out there. Not yet, I interrupted quickly. They need a cold snap to set the sugars properly, otherwise they turn bitter. I'm tracking the weather. The almanac says we're getting our first hard frost on the night of the 9th. I'm doing the full harvest on the morning of October 10th. The day after the autumn festival. I had just handed them the schedule, gift-wrapped. I had told them exactly what the crop was worth. And I had given them a deadline. You better put some guards on that field, boy, Simon chuckled nervously. That much money sitting in the dirt? People get funny ideas. Oh, I'm not worried, I said, spinning on my stool to face the room, letting my eyes lock directly onto Walter Higgins for a split second before sweeping past him. My property is secure. Besides, who in Oakhaven would steal from a neighbor? Walter didn't react, but Bradley stopped chewing. A slow, ugly smirk spread across the younger man's face. It was the exact same smirk he had worn right before he caved my skull in. My blood ran ice cold, but I forced my face to remain pleasant. I finished my coffee, tipped Brenda generously, and walked out of the diner. As I climbed into my truck, my hands were shaking not from fear, but from the massive adrenaline spike of putting the gears in motion. The next 2 weeks were a master class in psychological tension. I played the role of the oblivious, happy farmer to perfection. I spent my days working on the tractor, fixing fences, and whistling loudly. But at night, I became a ghost. I sat on the unlit back porch, wrapped in a dark blanket, watching the property line. They took the bait beautifully. 3 days after the diner conversation, I found the first sign. A section of the wire fencing near the rear of the yam field had been snipped and carefully twisted back together, just enough to allow a man to slip through. They were scouting the perimeter. 2 days later, I found footprints in the mud near the drainage ditch heavy. Size 12 work boots with a distinct lug pattern. Bradley's boots. He had been walking the edge of the field, probably measuring the distance from the road to figure out how far they would have to carry the sacks. They were arrogant. They thought I was stupid. They thought I was exactly the same naive victim I had been in my past life. As the calendar pages turned, inching closer to October 10th, the atmosphere on the farm grew thick, like the air right before a violent thunderstorm. Lily's health was stable, but the doctors in the city were pressing for a deposit for the surgery. I assured them I would have the funds by mid-October. The real yams were safely curing in the limestone cave, aging perfectly, their value only increasing. Finally, the day arrived. October 10th. The town of Oakhaven was buzzing. The high school football field was being set up with carnival games, cider stands, and a massive bonfire ring. Everyone in the county would be there from sundown until midnight. It was the perfect alibi. The perfect distraction. At 6:00 p.m., I loaded Lily into the passenger seat of my truck. She was bundled up in a thick coat, her face pale but smiling. We drove into town, parking right in the middle of Main Street where everyone could see my truck. I pushed her in a wheelchair through the festival, greeting neighbors, buying funnel cake, and making sure I was seen by as many people as possible. At 8:30 p.m., the fireworks show was announced. The crowd migrated toward the bleachers. "Lily," I whispered, kneeling beside her chair. "I need to run back to the farm really quick." I forgot my medication for my back. I'll be gone 20 minutes tops. You stay right here with Mrs. Gable. Lily nodded, her eyes reflecting the colorful lights of the carnival. Okay, Johnny. Hurry back for the fireworks. I slipped away from the crowd, bypassing my truck entirely. I had hidden an old, unregistered dirt bike in the woods behind the high school the night before. I kicked it to life, keeping the headlights off, and took the old logging trails back toward my property. The noise of the engine was completely drowned out by the opening booms of the fireworks echoing across the valley. I ditched the bike a mile from the farm and hiked the rest of the way on foot, moving silently through the dense autumn woods. I didn't go to the house. I went straight to the barn. I climbed the wooden ladder to the hayloft, a vantage point that overlooked the entire rear field. The loft was pitch black, smelling of dry alfalfa and old dust. I crawled to the edge of the loft doors, propped them open just a crack, and waited. The night was cold and remarkably clear. A full moon hung high in the sky, casting a pale silver glow over the farm. The yam field looked peaceful, the green tops swaying slightly in the breeze. For an hour, nothing happened. The only sounds were the distant, muffled pops of the fireworks in town and the chirping of crickets. I began to wonder if I had miscalculated. If they had gotten spooked, then, at 9:45 p.m., a dark shape rolled to a silent stop on the county road adjacent to my property line. It was a truck, its headlights completely killed. 2 doors opened with a soft click. 3 figures emerged from the vehicle. Even in the moonlight, I recognized the hulking silhouette of Bradley Higgins carrying a stack of large burlap sacks. Behind him walked Walter, holding a pair of heavy shovels, and trailing them, keeping watch, was Martha. They moved quickly and confidently, slipping through the gap in the fence they had prepared days earlier. They didn't even bother to stay low. They owned the night, just like they thought they owned everything else. From my hidden perch in the loft, a slow, dark smile stretched across my face. My heart hammered against my ribs. A chaotic rhythm of anticipation and deferred justice. Welcome to my field, I thought, watching Walter sink the first shovel deep into the poisoned earth. Dig deep. Take all you can carry. Dirt flew through the air, glinting like dark snow in the moonlight. From my hidden vantage point in the hayloft, the scent of crushed foliage and overturned earth drifted upward, masking the musty smell of dry alfalfa. Below me, the Higgins family worked with a frantic, feverish energy. Walter drove his shovel into the ground with the brutal efficiency of a man who had spent his life taking what wasn't his. His heavy work boots crushed the delicate green tops I had meticulously replanted. Beside him, Bradley was on his hands and knees, tearing at the loosened soil like a starving animal. "Look at the size of this one, Pop," Bradley grunted, his voice carrying easily on the crisp night air. He held up a massive cluster of dead man's fingers. The pale, yellowish-white roots looked horrifyingly perfect. In the silver light, they were indistinguishable from the fortune I had grown. Walter leaned on his spade, wiping sweat from his forehead with a dirty sleeve. "Don't just stand there gawking at it, boy. Throw it in the sack. We ain't got all night. Martha, keep that bag open." Martha, shivering in a quilted jacket, held the burlap sack wide. Bradley tossed the heavy root inside. The dull thud echoed like a gavel striking a judge's block. My heart hammered against my ribs, a relentless drumbeat of pure adrenaline. They had no idea. They had no gloves. I watched in fascinated horror as Bradley wiped his hands on his denim jeans, inadvertently smearing the highly toxic, yellowish sap of the Oenantha crocata across his clothes and skin. The sweet, almost parsnip-like odor of the broken roots must have been overwhelming down in the dirt, entirely masking the deadly neurotoxin seeping into the pores of his hands. "Keep digging," Walter hissed, his voice tight with greed. Fletcher said the boy had half an acre of these things. At $1,000 a pound. We're sitting on a gold mine. We'll fence him through my guy in the city tomorrow morning. That little orphan punk won't even know what hit him until the check is cashed. Think he'll cry? Bradley chuckled, a cruel, breathless sound as he yanked another cluster from the earth. Little Johnny crying over his dirt patch. Maybe I'll go down there tomorrow and offer my condolences. Give him a shoulder to cry on. The sheer arrogance of it made my blood run cold, solidifying the remaining fragments of my conscience into ice. In my previous life, that exact cruelty had culminated in a shovel blade splitting my skull. Now, they were digging their own graves, laughing as they did it. For 45 minutes, they pillaged the field. They ripped up every carefully placed cluster of dropwort, completely decimating the plot. The burlap sacks grew heavy, bulging with nearly 200 pounds of lethal vegetation. When they finally stopped, the field looked like a war zone, cratered, stripped, and entirely violated. "That's all of it," Walter wheezed, his chest heaving as he threw his shovel into the back of their rusted pickup. "Load the bags." Quietly, it took the two men significant effort to heave the heavy, sap-soaked sacks over the tailgate. The springs of the truck groaned under the weight. Martha scrambled into the passenger seat, looking nervously toward the dark windows of my farmhouse. "Let's get out of here before the kid gets back from the festival," Walter commanded, slamming the tailgate shut with a muffled metallic clatter. The truck engine sputtered to life. A low, rumbling idle. They didn't turn on their headlights until they were half a mile down the county road, vanishing into the tree line like the thieves they were. I remained in the hayloft for another 10 minutes, the silence of the farm rushing back in to fill the void they had left. The trap had sprung. The bait was taken. Now, the ticking clock was entirely out of my hands. Slipping down the ladder, I vanished into the woods. The sprint back to my hidden dirt bike was a blur of shadows and snapping twigs. I rode the trails like a demon, ditching the bike and merging back into the festival crowd just as the grand finale of the fireworks display lit up the sky in bursts of screaming neon. "Johnny!" Lily cheered, grabbing my hand as I slid in beside her wheelchair. "You made it back. Just in time. The big ones are starting. Wouldn't miss it for the world, kiddo," I whispered, squeezing her shoulder. I looked up at the exploding colors, my alibi cementing itself in front of 500 witnesses. The night was exactly as it was supposed to be. Dawn broke over Oakhaven with a sharp, biting chill. The frost hadn't fully settled yet, but the air tasted like winter. I walked out onto my back porch, a steaming mug of coffee in my hand, and played my part. I let my eyes drift over the property line, down to the deer-fenced enclosure. I dropped the mug. The ceramic shattered against the wooden floorboards, splashing dark liquid across my boots. My scream of anguish was completely genuine, not for the loss of the crop, but drawing on the raw, unprocessed trauma of the death I had suffered in the previous timeline. The terror, the helplessness, the suffocating smoke of the burning barn. I let it all flood into my voice. "No, no, 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 no," I bellowed, vaulting over the porch railing and sprinting toward the ruined field. By the time I reached the dirt, I was gasping for air. I fell to my knees in the mud, staring at the cratered earth. I didn't have to fake the trembling in my hands. The sight of the overturned soil was a visceral reminder of what the Higgins family was capable of. 10 minutes later, I was on the phone with County Dispatch. 20 minutes after that, Sheriff Mateo's cruiser came kicking up gravel down my long driveway. Sheriff Mateo was a stern, aging man with a thick gray mustache and a reputation for being strictly by the book. He stepped out of his vehicle, adjusting his utility belt, his eyes already scanning the devastation. "Jonathan," he said softly. Walking up to where I sat slumped against a fence post, my head in my hands. "Dispatch said there was a robbery." "Jesus, son, it looks like a bomb went off in here." "They took everything, Sheriff," I choked out, forcing tears into my eyes. I looked up at him, making sure he saw the sheer desperation on my face. The crested whites. The whole harvest. I was pulling them tomorrow. It was for Lily. It was her surgery money. "It's gone." Mateo's face hardened. He crouched down, examining the deep boot prints left in the soft mud. Heavy treads. Work boots. Multiple suspects, judging by the varying depth of the prints and the sheer volume of dirt moved. "You see anything? Hear anything?" "Nothing," I lied, my voice cracking perfectly. I was at the festival with Lily all night. The whole town saw us. I came home, put her to bed, and didn't even look out the window. I didn't see it until this morning. A secondary vehicle pulled up. It was Simon Fletcher, the produce broker. Someone at dispatch must have tipped him off. He bounded out of his car, his face pale and slick with anxious sweat. "Jonathan, tell me it isn't true," Simon wailed, staring at the empty field. "The tubers. Are they gone?" "Every last one," Mateo confirmed grimly, standing up. "Mr. Fletcher, since you're the one who seems to know the value of this crop, who else knew about it?" Simon swallowed hard, his eyes darting around nervously. "Well, Sheriff, Jonathan and I were talking about it at Brenda's diner a couple of weeks ago. I might have. Well, the whole diner probably heard. I mentioned how much they were worth. And who was in the diner?" Mateo pressed, pulling a small notepad from his breast pocket. "A lot of folks," Simon stammered. "But, well, Walter Higgins and his boy were sitting right in the back booth, and Jonathan mentioned he wasn't pulling them until the 10th. Mateo stopped writing. The pencil hovered over the paper. In a small town like Oakhaven, the Higgins family's reputation preceded them. They had been suspects in a dozen petty thefts and property disputes, but nothing this massive. "I see," Mateo said slowly. He looked up toward the hill, where the roof of the Higgins ranch was visible through the autumn trees. "Jonathan, I'm going to have my deputies comb this area for evidence. I need you to stay with your sister. Don't go doing anything foolish, you hear me?" "What can I do?" I whispered, looking utterly defeated. They won. Whoever did this, they took Lily's life with them. Leaving the sheriff to secure the scene, I walked slowly back to the house. Once inside, the mask of the broken victim slipped away. I locked the front door and walked into the kitchen, turning on the police scanner I kept on the counter. The air crackled with static. The trap was closing. The Higgins family had the poison. They had the motive. They had the means. Now, it was only a matter of time before their arrogance forced their hand. They wouldn't just sell it. Walter was a man who needed to bask in his victories. He needed to gloat. And a tuber that expensive? A man like Walter would never let it leave his property without taking a taste of his conquest first. I poured myself a fresh cup of coffee, pulled a chair up to the scanner, and waited for the screams. The radio remained agonizingly silent for hours. I paced the wooden floors of the farmhouse, the tension coiling in my stomach like a tight spring. What if they had immediately driven the haul to the city? What if the fence realized what it was? No, I reminded myself. Oenantha crocata is almost impossible to identify by sight if you aren't a botanist. The fence will just see a weird, pale root. At 1:15 p.m., the scanner erupted. The voice of the county dispatcher, usually calm and bored, was pitched an octave higher, frantic and urgent. Unit 4, redirect to the Higgins Ranch, 4402 Ridge Road. We have a priority medical emergency. Caller reports 2 adult males in severe distress. Active seizures, foaming at the mouth. Send paramedics immediately. Copy? I stopped dead in my tracks. The coffee mug in my hand trembled slightly. Copy dispatch. Unit 4 en route. What's the nature of the emergency? Overdose? Unknown. Unit 4. Caller is the wife, Martha Higgins. She is hysterical. Says they ate something from the garden and collapsed. She says they can't breathe. Move fast. Unit 4. A cold, terrifying satisfaction washed over me. The venom had taken hold. I grabbed my coat and truck keys. I couldn't stay away. I needed to see it. I needed to know that the universe had balanced the scales. I drove up the winding dirt road toward the Higgins property, parking my truck on the shoulder about 200 yards from their main gate. I wasn't the only one. The wail of sirens had alerted the neighboring farms, and a small crowd of onlookers had already begun to gather near the barbed wire fence. drawn by the morbid curiosity that fuels small towns. I blended into the back of the group just as the ambulance came tearing up the driveway, its lights flashing violently against the gray afternoon sky. Sheriff Mateo's cruiser was right behind it. We couldn't see into the house, but the front door was thrown wide open. Martha Higgins was standing on the porch, her hands covered in something dark, screaming at the paramedics as they rushed past her with a gurney. "They were just celebrating!" Her voice carried down the hill, shrill and shattered. "We were just having lunch. He cut a piece off the root to fry it. He just wanted a taste." I pushed my way slightly forward, my eyes locked on the front door. A few moments later, the paramedics emerged. They were struggling to control the gurney. Strapped to it was Bradley. His massive frame was convulsing violently, the straps digging into his flesh. But it wasn't the seizures that made the crowd gasp. It was his face. The antitoxin had fully attacked his central nervous system. His facial muscles were locked in a horrific, permanent spasm. His lips were pulled back so far, his gums were entirely exposed, stretching his mouth into a ghastly, ear-to-ear grin. It was the Rhizus sardonicus, the devil's smile. His eyes, wide and rolling in panic, violently contrasted the grotesque grin plastered across his face. He looked like a terrifying, demonic caricature of a human being. "Jesus Christ," a farmer next to me muttered, crossing himself. A second set of paramedics brought Walter out. He was no longer convulsing. He was eerily still, a breathing tube already shoved down his throat, but he wore the exact same horrific, unnatural smile as his son. The smirk that had haunted my nightmares was now a permanent, macabre fixture on his dying face. Sheriff Mateo walked out onto the porch, looking profoundly shaken. He held up a clear, plastic evidence bag. Inside it was a half-eaten chunk of the pale root, and a paring knife smeared with yellowish sap. He looked at Martha, who was sobbing uncontrollably on the steps. "Martha," Mateo's voice boomed, cutting through the chaos. "Where did this come from?" "I don't know," she wailed, clutching her chest. "Walter brought it in. He said it was a victory meal. He said the little rat next door grew a fortune, and we were eating like kings." The silence that fell over the crowd of onlookers was absolute. Every head slowly turned toward the evidence bag in the sheriff's hand. And then, slowly, toward the back of the crowd. Toward me. Sheriff Mateo's eyes locked onto mine through the distance. He didn't look suspicious of me. He looked horrified by the realization of what had just transpired. "Sheriff!" one of the paramedics shouted from the back of the ambulance. "We're losing the older one. His heart rate is plummeting. We need to move, now." The ambulance doors slammed shut, and the vehicle tore off down the driveway, the sirens screaming a death knell across the valley. I stood there in the cold dirt, watching the flashing lights disappear down the road. The men who had murdered me, the men who had stolen my future and laughed about it, had just dug their own graves, prepared their own poison, and consumed it with a smile. I didn't smile back. I simply turned up my collar against the wind, slipped through the whispering crowd, and walked back to my truck. My real harvest was still safe in the limestone cave, waiting to cure. Lily was safe, and the Higgins farm, built on decades of theft and intimidation, had just collapsed under the weight of its own greed. The universe had balanced the scales, and I didn't even have to get my hands dirty. Dust settled over the dirt road, long after the ambulance sirens faded into the distance. The crowd of onlookers slowly dispersed, muttering in hushed, terrified tones about the gruesome scene they had just witnessed. Nobody spoke to me. They didn't need to. The connection had already been made in their minds. The Higgins family stole from Jonathan, and the universe struck them down with a biblical swiftness. Walking back to my farmhouse, the silence was profound. Lily was sitting on the living room rug, playing a board game by herself, completely unaware of the macabre tragedy unfolding just over the hill. "Did you find your medicine, Johnny?" she asked, looking up with large, trusting eyes. "I did, sweetie," I replied, forcing a gentle smile as I ruffled her hair. "Everything is going to be just fine now." Less than 2 hours later, the heavy knock came at the front door. I opened it to find Sheriff Mateo standing on the porch. He looked 10 years older than he had that morning. His shoulders slumped, and the deep lines around his mouth were drawn tight with exhaustion. Behind him, parked in the driveway, was an unmarked black SUV belonging to the State Agricultural Department. "Jonathan," Mateo said heavily, removing his hat. "We need to talk." "Of course, Sheriff," I said, stepping aside to let him into the kitchen. "How are Walter and Bradley?" "The whole town is saying they got sick." Mateo sank into a wooden chair at the kitchen table, running a hand over his graying face. "They're gone, son." Bradley was pronounced dead on arrival at the county hospital. Walter's heart gave out 10 minutes later in the emergency room. "Martha is in psychiatric hold." She completely snapped. I let out a ragged breath, slumping against the counter. I didn't have to fake the shock that washed over me. Though the emotion fueling it wasn't grief. It was the staggering, absolute finality of it. The monsters who had haunted my previous life, who had beaten me to death in the cold mud, were erased from the board. "My God," I whispered, staring blindly at the floorboards. "How? What happened?" "That's what I'm here to figure out," Mateo said, his tone shifting from sympathetic to strictly professional. He gestured toward the front door. "I brought Dr. Eris Linwood with me. He's the lead botanist for the state university. We had him examine the root chunk Walter left on the cutting board, and the sacks of vegetation we found in the back of the Higgins pickup truck." My pulse hammered a steady rhythm against my throat, but I kept my breathing even. "Did they steal my crop, Sheriff?" "They did," Mateo confirmed. "Martha confessed to the whole thing. Said Walter planned it out after hearing you and Simon Fletcher bragging at the diner. They cut your fence, dug up the field, and hauled it off last night while you were at the festival." "Then what killed them?" I demanded, pushing off the counter, letting a wave of righteous confusion enter my voice. "The crested whites are a delicacy. They're completely safe. I've eaten the test cuttings myself." Mateo looked at me for a long, agonizing moment. His eyes were searching, probing for a crack in my facade. Dr. Linwood confirmed that what the Higgins family stole were not crested white yams. Not a single one of them. The sacks were filled with Oenantha crocata, hemlock water dropwort, dead man's fingers. I let my jaw drop. I backed away, shaking my head violently. No. No. That's impossible. I planted those yams 3 years ago. I cultivated that soil. I invested everything into that field. Dr. Linwood went out to your field an hour ago to examine the disturbed soil," Mateo continued, his voice relentless. "He found the remaining root structures. The entire half-acre was populated with the dropwort. Jonathan, how does a farmer spend 3 years cultivating a field of the deadliest neurotoxic weed on the continent without knowing it?" This was the crux of the trap, the moment where my life hung in the balance. I leaned heavily on the kitchen island, burying my face in my hands, shoulders shaking as if overwhelmed by a sudden, devastating realization. "The flood," I choked out, looking up at him with tear-filled eyes. 2 springs ago, the Blackwood River broke its banks and flooded the lower valley. The water sat in that field for a month before it drained. Mateo frowned, pulling out his notepad. "Go on. The crested whites are incredibly fragile," I explained, my voice trembling with the perfect pitch of a broken man, realizing he had lost everything. "They must have rotted in the standing water. But the dropwort, it thrives in marshes. The floodwaters must have carried the seeds down from the Blackwood swamps and deposited them right into my tilled soil." I paced the kitchen, waving my hands frantically. "The tops look exactly like the yam foliage." "Sheriff, you can ask Simon Fletcher. They look like thick, leafy greens. I never pulled a full root because you aren't supposed to disturb the tuber until the final harvest. I thought I was growing a fortune. I thought I was saving my sister. And all this time, I was watering a field of weeds." I let out a harsh, bitter laugh that cracked in the middle. "If they hadn't stolen them, if I had harvested them tomorrow, like I planned, I would have shipped them to those fancy restaurants in the city. I would have poisoned hundreds of people." The silence in the kitchen was absolute. The narrative was bulletproof because it relied on the one thing farmers fear most: the unpredictable, destructive nature of nature itself. Mateo stared at me, the suspicion in his eyes slowly giving way to a sickening realization. The timeline fit. The flood had indeed ravaged the lower properties 2 years prior. The visual similarity between the plants was a documented botanical fact. "Jonathan," Mateo finally said, his voice softening, "you didn't know. They stole my weeds," I whispered, collapsing into a chair across from him, burying my head in my arms. "They stole my weeds and ate them, and my real crop is dead." Sheriff Mateo closed his notepad and stood up. He placed a heavy, comforting hand on my shoulder. "It's a tragedy, son. A senseless, greedy tragedy. But it's not your fault. The Higgins family orchestrated a grand larceny, and they paid the ultimate price for their own ignorance. The state will issue a mandate to chemically burn that field to ensure the dropwort doesn't spread, but no charges will be filed against you." As the sheriff walked out the front door, leaving me alone in the quiet house, I kept my head down until the sound of his cruiser tires faded onto the main road. Slowly, I lifted my face from my arms. The tears were gone. The trembling had stopped. The alibi had held, cemented by the undeniable proof of Walter's own greed. The field would be burned, erasing any lingering evidence of my midnight replanting. I walked over to the window, watching the state agricultural truck pull away from the property line. Burn the field, I thought, a cold satisfaction settling deep into my bones. I don't need it anymore. News of the poisoning spread through the county like wildfire, carrying a grim, unspoken lesson. The local papers ran front-page stories detailing the bizarre and horrific end of the Higgins family. The official police report cited accidental poisoning during the commission of a felony. Martha Higgins never returned to the ranch. After her release from the psychiatric ward, she moved in with her sister 3 states away, a broken shell of the venomous woman who had once sneered at my murder. With Walter and Bradley dead, and Martha gone, the sprawling Higgins estate quickly collapsed into administrative chaos. The bank moved in within weeks. It turned out Walter had been remortgaging the ranch for years to cover massive gambling debts and a string of failed investments. With no one to make the payments, the property went into immediate foreclosure. As the county busied itself dismantling the Higgins legacy, I waited for the dust to settle. The state agricultural department had come and gone, dousing my empty half-acre in harsh herbicides and turning the soil black. To the outside world, I was a tragic figure, a poor farmer who had lost his miracle crop to a cruel twist of nature. But beneath the surface, deep in the limestone roots of the earth, my real miracle was waiting. Exactly 1 month after the night of the harvest, I drove my truck down the old logging trail behind my property. The autumn leaves had fallen, leaving the woods bare and skeletal. I parked near the hidden entrance of the old homesteader's cave, pulling a heavy flashlight from the glove compartment. The air inside the limestone cavern was perfectly crisp, sitting at a consistent 50 degrees. I walked past the ancient, rotting wooden support beams toward the back of the cave, where I had stacked the heavy wooden crates. I pried the lid off the top crate. The earthy, intoxicating aroma of the crested white yams wafted up, rich and entirely distinct from the sweet, deceptive scent of the dropwort. I pulled back the layers of newspaper. They were magnificent. The curing process in the cool, dry air had allowed the skins to thicken slightly, locking in the dense, sugary starches. The white, marbled flesh beneath the knobby exteriors was pristine. They hadn't just survived the swap. They had thrived in the dark. I loaded the crates into the back of my truck, covering them with a heavy canvas tarp. It was time to cash in. I didn't call Simon Fletcher to the farm. I drove directly to his processing facility on the outskirts of the city. When I pulled up to the loading dock and threw back the tarp, Simon's jaw practically hit the pavement. "Jonathan," he stammered, his eyes wide as he picked up a massive 3-pound tuber, inspecting it with trembling hands. The sheriff said. "The whole town said the field was entirely dropwort. They said the flood ruined them. The flood ruined the lower half of the field. I lied smoothly, leaning against the tailgate. The upper terrace survived. I harvested these a week before the Higgins family broke in. I've been curing them in a root cellar. I kept my mouth shut because I didn't want any more trouble from the police or the press. Simon didn't care about the logistics. He only saw the sheer, unadulterated profit sitting in the bed of my truck. These are perfect. The curing process. The skin density. Jonathan, these are grade A restaurant quality. I have buyers in Manhattan who will bleed for these. Then let's make them bleed, I said, my voice hard and flat. But I want it wired directly to my account by the end of the day. No installments. The weighing process took 3 hours. Every tuber was meticulously cleaned, measured, and graded. Out of the 200 pounds I had smuggled out of the field, 180 pounds made the absolute highest grade. When Simon handed me the final invoice, the number printed at the bottom of the page sent a jolt of pure electricity through my system. $162,000. It was more money than I had ever seen in my 2 lifetimes combined. It was the price of my blood in the previous timeline, now reclaimed through cunning and ruthlessness. The transfer is initiated, Simon said, wiping his brow. You did it, Jonathan. You really did it. I took the invoice, folded it neatly, and placed it in my breast pocket. I didn't feel the need to celebrate with him. I simply shook his hand, climbed back into my truck, and drove away. The drive back to Oakhaven felt different. The ever-present weight of dread, the suffocating fear of the Higgins family, the desperate panic over Lily's failing health that had all evaporated, replaced by a cold, structural peace. I pulled into the driveway just as the sun was setting. Lily was sitting on the porch swing, wrapped in a blanket. I walked up the steps, sat beside her, and pulled her into a tight hug. Pack your bags, kiddo, I whispered into her hair, listening to the slight wheeze in her chest that would soon be a memory. We're going to the city tomorrow. Doctor, Linwood at the Pulmonary Center has a room waiting for you. Lily looked up at me, her eyes shining with unshed tears. Really, Johnny? We have enough? We have more than enough, I promised her. I looked across the property line, up toward the dark, empty windows of the foreclosed Higgins ranch. We have everything we need. The sterile, bright lights of the city hospital were a stark contrast to the rustic darkness of Oakhaven. For 6 agonizing hours, I paced the waiting room floor of the pediatric surgery wing, drinking terrible coffee and staring at the clock. This was the variable I couldn't control. I could outsmart greedy neighbors. I could manipulate the law, but I couldn't guide the surgeon's scalpel. In my past life, this day never came. Lily had died in her bedroom, waiting for a harvest that had been stolen over my dead body. When the double doors swung open and the lead surgeon walked out, still in his green scrubs with his mask pulled down, my heart stopped beating. He looked at me, a tired but genuine smile spreading across his face. Jonathan? The surgery was a complete success. The arterial graft took perfectly. Her lungs are functioning at full capacity. She's going to have a long, completely normal life. The relief was physical. It crashed over me like a tidal wave, dropping me to my knees right there in the hallway. The nurses had to help me into a chair, bringing me water as I sobbed uncontrollably. The cold, calculating armor I had worn for the past 2 months shattered completely, leaving only the raw, desperate love of a brother who had finally saved his sister. Lily spent 3 weeks in recovery. When we finally drove back to Oakhaven, the air was thick with the promise of winter. Snow dusted the fields, burying the ashes of my old life under a blanket of pure, untouched white. But the business of Oakhaven hadn't stopped. On a frigid Tuesday morning in early December, the county held a public auction on the steps of the courthouse. The item on the docket was the 400-acre Higgins cattle ranch, complete with the main house, 3 barns, and extensive fencing. The bidding started low. The property carried a dark stigma now. People whispered that the land was cursed, that the ghosts of Walter and Bradley haunted the pastures. No one in the tight-knit farming community wanted to take on the bad juju associated with the devil's smile. I stood at the back of the crowd, wearing a heavy wool coat, my hands buried deep in my pockets. Do I hear 80,000? the auctioneer called out, his breath pluming in the cold air. Silence. 80,000 for 400 acres of prime grazing land, folks. This is a steal. I raised my bidding paddle. 100,000. The crowd turned as one, staring at me in shock. The very man who had been victimized by the Higgins family was now bidding on their empire. I have 100,000 from the gentleman in the back, the auctioneer said, recovering quickly. Do I hear 1 to 10? The silence stretched on, heavy and absolute. Nobody was going to bid against me. Some saw it as poetic justice. Others were simply too uncomfortable with the optics. Going once. Going twice. Sold to the young man in the back. The gavel came down with a sharp crack. I walked up to the clerk's table, signed the necessary paperwork, and handed over a cashier's check that drained a significant portion of my yam profits. I didn't care. The money was merely a tool. That afternoon, I drove my tractor up the hill to the property line separating my small farm from the sprawling Higgins estate. I attached a heavy chain to the sturdy wooden fence posts that Walter Higgins had erected 30 years ago to intimidate my grandfather. I threw the tractor into reverse and gunned the engine. The wood groaned, splintered, and gave way with a satisfying crack. I spent the rest of the day tearing down the barrier, merging the two properties into one massive, undivided expanse of land. Standing on the porch of the empty Higgins house, looking down at my small farmhouse in the valley below, the circle finally felt complete. The men who had killed me for a patch of dirt had unwittingly handed me the keys to a kingdom. They thought they were the apex predators of Oak Haven. They believed that strength and cruelty were the only currencies that mattered. But they had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the game. Survival isn't about being the loudest or the most brutal. It's about adaptation. It's about knowing what lies beneath the surface and having the sheer, unflinching will to let your enemies dig their own graves. Spring would come eventually. The snow would melt, the soil would soften, and the fields would be ready to plant once more. I would expand the crested white yam operation across the very land Walter Higgins had bled for. I would turn the graveyard of his legacy into an empire of my own. I am not the same man who died in the mud that October night. The blood that soaked into the earth changed me, forged me into something harder, colder, and infinitely more dangerous. I was reborn in the ashes of my own murder, and I had learned the ultimate lesson of the harvest. Sometimes, to grow something truly beautiful, you have to bury the rot deep in the dirt and simply smile as it chokes on its own roots. Thank you so much for writing out this crazy journey of vengeance and rebirth with me. The story of Jonathan and the lethal harvest proves that sometimes karma doesn't just come around, it's carefully planted, watered, and left waiting for the wicked to dig it up themselves. True survival is about outsmarting the monsters, not just fighting them. If this twisted tale of justice kept you on the edge of your seat and made you think twice about what's buried in the dark, please do me a massive favor. Hit that like button to support the channel. Share this video with anyone who loves a dark, satisfying revenge story, and absolutely smash that subscribe button for more intense, first-person storytelling. Drop a comment below telling me what you would have done in Jonathan's shoes. Stay safe, stay smart, and remember, always check what you're pulling out of the dirt.